Hello aspiring sailors. In this lesson we're going to be going over the rules of the road when you're sailing. So by now you've already sailed a bit and you've been on the water a few times. So you may have wondered, whatever happened if you and another boat were going to crash? Well, in this lesson we're going to go over what would happen if you ever found yourself in this unlucky scenario. Alright, so much like when you're driving, when you're sailing, you have rules to tell you what to do if you're ever going to crash into another boat. These rules are 1. The starboard and port rule. 2. The windward and leeward rule. 3. The overtaking boat rule. 4. The tacking boat rule. Now, these names aren't necessarily universal, and people don't necessarily call them the exact same thing, but these are 4 ideas that you have to consider whenever you're sailing. Alright, so let's go over them one by one. Alright, so let's start with the starboard and port rule. In life, you have a right hand and a left hand. The same goes for whenever you're in a boat. You have a right hand side of the boat and a left hand side of the boat. When you're sailing, you call right hand starboard and left port. So, in this boat here, for example, the starboard side would be right here, while the port side would be right here. So when it comes to the rules of the road and how to avoid collisions, we normally address this starboard and port idea with which side of the boat the wind is coming from. In this boat right here, boat number 1, the wind is coming over the starboard side of the boat, as seen as their mainsail is catching the wind on a close-hauled course. In boat number 2, the wind is coming over the port side of the boat, and the mainsail is catching the wind on the port side. In sailing, we call these 2 boats here starboard tack, and this boat port tack. So, whenever 2 boats are going to on a collision course or going to collide, the boat that is on starboard tack has the right of way. This means that the starboard boat is not supposed to move out of the way of the port boat. So, let's look at this scenario. In this scenario, the starboard boat is heading on a close-hauled course in this direction. The port boat, boat number 2 on port tack, is heading on a close-hauled course in this direction. As seen right here, these boats will collide. So, to avoid collision, the boat that has port tack has to avoid this boat on starboard tack at all costs. They could do this in a few ways. Number 1, this boat on port tack can slow down. 2, this boat on port tack can avoid the other boat. How, you may ask? Well, when this boat moves forward in this direction, this boat will duck them or go behind them. So let's see that in an actual drawing. So here we have it. In this scenario, the boat on port tack has ducked and effectively avoided the boat on starboard tack. So, the port and starboard rule is that boats on a starboard tack have the right of way, which means they don't have to try to avoid the collision. Therefore, it's up to the boat on port tack to slow down, get out of the way, or anything that they need to do. Okay, rule number 2. When you have two boats, like here, the boat to the leeward has right of way. What does leeward mean, may I ask? Well, when you have two boats lined up in a situation like this, with one boat on top of the other, in the case of the wind, the boat that is closer to the wind is called windward, while the boat that is farther from the wind is called leeward. So, whenever two boats are like this boat is called the windward boat, and this boat is called the leeward boat. So, what's the rules when it comes to the rules of the road? Well, windward boat has to take all necessary measures to avoid the leeward boat. That means, if they're both going in one direction, this boat can't suddenly cut the other boat off and cause a collision. Okay, rule number 3, the overtaking boat rule. When you have two boats that are going in the same direction, the boat that is behind any other boat and is trying to overtake it has to try to avoid collision with this boat. Let's call this boat number 1 and boat number 2. What the overtaking boat rule says is that boat number 2 has to take all the necessary precautions and avoid collision with boat number 1, no matter what. So that means, if you are racing against your friend when you're sailing, and you're right behind them, you can't just make them move out of the way because you're going faster. What you have to do is you have to avoid them by going around them. So this can either mean heading up to get around them, bearing off, or anything else that's necessary. Alright, so next, rule number 4, the tacking rule. As an example, let's say that you and another boat are sailing in the same direction. If you decide, all of a sudden, to tack and cut this boat off, do you have any rights? Do they have to avoid you? That's the question when we're talking about rule number 4, tacking. Overall, when you're tacking, you have no right of way. You don't have any rights. You are the one responsible for avoiding collision. Meaning that you can't just cut this other boat off when you're tacking. That's a big no. Alright? So, just let's go over this. When you're tacking, you have no rights. Okay, so we've gone over the 4 major rules of the road. So, let's review. First of all, do we have any questions here? Right, well, if you need to let people know what they have to do, you have to really try to communicate with them. You have to yell out very loud. You have to say, "Hey, I'm on starboard!" to them. That lets them know what they're going to do. Do you understand? Okay, so if everybody understands, we'll just now review the rules of the road before we go outside and try these on the water. Alright? Okay, so rule number 1, the starboard and port rule. First of all, who here knows what starboard means? Okay, so we've gone over the 4 major rules of the road. So, let's review. Okay, so rule number 1, the starboard and port rule. People on starboard tack, when they're on a collision course with someone else, have right of way over people on port tack. So this means that boats on port tack, like this boat right here, have to do all they can to avoid a boat on starboard tack. For example, this boat could either go behind the other one or could slow down altogether. So the second rule is the windward leeward rule. In this rule, it says that the windward boat has to avoid the leeward boat, meaning that the leeward boat will have right of way. So now let's go to the overtaking boat rule. In the overtaking boat rule, it says that the overtaking boat, which in this case would be here, has to avoid this boat. So if boat number 1 wants to try to overtake boat number 2, he or she has to sail around and avoid collision. So, any questions with that one? Alright, good. Yeah, I know it's a pretty straightforward rule. Okay, so, rule number 4, tacking. The tacking rule is that any boat that's tacking doesn't have any rights when it comes to the rules of the road when you're sailing. So that means in this situation right here, this boat that wants to tack can't, because it'll run into this boat right here. Alright, so that's the end of our red light, green light rules of the road for sailing review and lesson. So let's get out on the water.